Hey everyone, it's Jess. Today is Wednesday and I thought, according to my schedule, I could do one of either two different types of videos. The first one is either I could do a weird plant Wednesday or a wax plant Wednesday, and I thought today, guys, I thought I might feature a weirder looking plant, and that is this plant right here. This is known as the rabbit foot fern. It's got these crazy little legs that look like tarantula legs, if you can see there, which sort of creep out from the side of the plant. And yeah guys, he's very unusual. But guys, I thought I would do a care video on the rabbit's foot fern. It's actually my only fern that I have, and what I can say, guys, is if you are getting into ferns, or you want to get into ferns and you're a little bit unsure about them, because I know that ferns can have a little bit of a reputation for being quite fussy and high maintenance, but guys, the rabbit foot fern is one of these ferns which I think is a great beginner fern, because it's actually quite easy to take care of, or at least I haven't had much trouble with it. So I've had my rabbit foot fern for about a year now, and it's definitely grown a lot from when I first got it. Having said that, I think I could have encouraged this guy to grow a lot more, but I would say that at the moment I'm kind of limited in space, so I've kept him in his nursery pot. It is probably time for him to be repotted, because when you press against the container, it's actually quite firm. So that's a sign, guys, you might want to repot your plants. If you are feeling, particularly plastic containers, they don't really give way when you press them down, that's probably a sign that your plant is ready for a repot. Guys, my rabbit foot fern, I got him at one of the commercial nurseries in Sydney called Flower Power. I got him about a year ago, and yeah, he's pretty cool. He's a pretty weird looking dude. The reason why I got him was obviously because the weirder the plant, the more I'm attracted to it, and definitely his little rhizomes made that cut for me. The rabbit foot fern is a fern that's native to the Pacific Islands, and it hails from, I believe, Fiji. It's an epiphyte, so we know that epiphytes, they're plants that live on other plants. They're plants that can survive on the crevices of rocks. They also can live on top of debris. The rabbit foot fern is of course characterized by its furry rhizomes, which look like rabbit feet. Now, rhizomes are the roots that exist on top of the soil. They're not the roots that exist beneath the soil. And the thing about rhizomes is that they also help the plant get the nutrients and water it needs, and that's not necessarily from the soil itself. It can actually be from the air, the water around it, the moisture, and probably from some falling debris, which is quite a cool characteristic, right? Like, to think that plants have just adapted and evolved to be able to survive given their climate is pretty fascinating. In terms of growth for this plant, the maximum height for this plant is between 30 centimeters to 60 centimeters tall, so that's quite a big, you can imagine, it's quite a sizable plant. I think these plants look the best in hanging baskets because the little furry feet will encase around the basket, and I will actually insert some photos here of some really amazing rabbit foot fern. In terms of growing, the fronds, so these leafy bits, actually come out from the rhizomes itself. And keep that in mind when we talk about propagating, because when we want to propagate a rabbit foot fern, what you want to do is to ensure that you cut a little bit of rhizome that has a frond. This plant is also not toxic to pets, so it is a good addition to any houseplant collection. The reason why I say that this fern is a good entry level fern is because from a lighting, humidity and watering perspective, this fern is actually not that fussy. In terms of lighting, of course, we like bright indirect light, so this plant would enjoy that type of lighting. However, I would say that I've been keeping my plant at the back of my outdoor greenhouse, so he's in a corner right at the back, and I actually think that he hasn't had much complaints. He's still been able to grow, and that area actually doesn't get a lot of sun, is actually quite shaded because he really just sits in the back corner of my greenhouse. The only thing from lighting I would say is you want to avoid some bright direct light, and that is because that will give your plant sunburn. And actually I think I can show you some examples of where some of his leaves has actually been burnt by the sun. That's an example of what sunburn looks like. From a temperature perspective, this plant does well in quite warm temperatures given that it hails from the Pacific Islands. So temperature range between 18 to 26 degrees will do quite well for this fern. I've seen on the internet they've said not to let this guy exist in temperatures of below 13 degrees Celsius. However, I've kept my fern outside. It lives outdoors, and in winter, in the Sydney winter, it gets to lows of about 6 degrees. But this guy seems to still survive, and I think a reason because of that is my greenhouse is sheltered, number one, and number two, it also lives quite clustered with some of his other plant friends. So I think from that he's quite a sheltered plant. So do keep that in mind if you're deciding to keep your fern outdoors. If you are, just make sure that you keep an eye out on the temperature. When it gets too hot, you want to make sure you cool your plant down by misting it a little bit. In Sydney in summer, there were days that it got up to about 40 degrees, which was quite warm. So what I did was I just gave him a bit of spritz of mist to cool him down. As long as it doesn't get above 30 degrees, I'd say, and you're keeping him in a shady location, temperature wise, I wouldn't be too fussed about it. You are keeping this plant indoors, however, the one tip I would say is keep it away from areas where it gets quite draughty, where you have some wind passages, so maybe in a hallway, because this guy's probably not going to appreciate the cold wind as much. In terms of watering, the reason why I've said this guy is a tolerant and quite a resilient fern is from a watering perspective. You don't need to keep an eye out on watering too much. Of course, the information on the internet has said that you want to keep his soil moist, which of course I would highly recommend, but to the extent you forget to water him and you see his soil become bone dry, don't worry too much, he's not going to die on you. Of course, I would not recommend you underwater your plant often because that's not great for your plant, but as long as you water quite regularly and you keep the soil moist, he tends to be quite happy. The one thing I would say about watering is you don't want to water so much so that the soil becomes soggy, and the reason for that is because this guy actually has quite shallow roots, because he's also supplemented by the fact that he's got these rhizomes to help him get nutrients. So you don't want to make the soil too waterlogged or too soggy, because that will just encourage root rot for the roots beneath the substrate. From a soil perspective, this plant likes to be in quite a rich compost type of soil, so you would like to keep this plant in a mix of peat moss, orchid bark and some perlite. It does still need to be well draining because this plant is an epiphyte, so it can survive in environments where there's not a lot of soil. What that says to me is that you still need to give this plant, particularly the roots in the soil, a chance to breathe. So I would recommend quite a aerated mix of peat, orchid bark and perlite. I'd recommend peat moss for this plant. The reason for that is, as an epiphyte, it can also grow on debris which can decompose, so that decomposing organic matter actually gives nutrients for this plant. So that's why I would suggest using peat moss as well, because it's a medium that has more compost on it. In terms of repotting, they say that you want to repot your plant every 2 years, and the pot to give it is going to be slightly bigger than the pot it currently exists in. As I said at the beginning, he's feeling quite robust in his current pot, so I think it's a sign for me that next growing season I should repot him. A tip for repotting is that you don't ever want to pot these furry rhizomes beneath the soil, because they're not supposed to exist beneath the soil. If you do, it will encourage rot on your plant, which is something you don't want to get. Another tip for repotting is if you find you're getting a lot of rabbit feet and they've become quite tightly bound around your container, a good tip you could do is dunk your pot in water for about 15 minutes or so, because that would actually help loosen your rhinestones, and that should make it easier for you to prise his little feet off his container. In terms of propagation for this plant can be propagated if you take one of his rabbit's feet with at least 1 or 2 stems or fronds, and what you do is you can pop it on a medium such as perlite with a bit of water, or on top of some soil, and you can hold that bit of rhinestone down with a toothpick or a wire. You don't want to pot this rhinestone in the soil because that encourages rot. You do then want to let it sit on top of that medium, and after a couple of weeks, if you do see new fronds coming out, that means that you've successfully propagated your plant. From a growing perspective, this plant grows by spreading its rhinestones. I mentioned before, its fronds come out from its rhinestones. Its rhinestones will grow wherever it finds or feels moist surfaces, and you can be sure that once it attaches to that moist surface and it likes those conditions there, it will pop out some of these fronds. In terms of maintenance for this plant, and also probably troubleshooting this plant, its leaves actually have quite a nice sheen to it, quite a glossy sheen. If you do start noticing those leaves become more pale in color, that might be a sign that your plant is becoming sunburnt, and particularly when it browns around the edges. Yellowing could be a sign that your plant actually is being overwatered, and that particularly when the fronds are also quite mushy to touch. If you do see leaves that have browned off, these are the leaves that you should actually prune, because pruning your plant ensures that it doesn't attract any pests. In terms of taking care of the rhinestones now the rhinestones actually should be a nice white in color. New rhinestones are green in color. If they start to turn brown, so that would be a sign that your plant might not be getting enough humidity or water. So that's when you should look out for the color of your rhinestones. They should be white or green and a little bit fluffy. If they are turning brown, then that would be a sign to either water your plant or to increase the humidity. Humidity perspective, as a fern, it obviously likes a bit of humidity. However, having said that, the reason why it's an easy fern to take care of is if you don't give it humidity, it's not going to hate you. Given that I keep my fern outside, I don't really have the best humid environment for him, but he still does quite well. But in terms of humidity, guys, ideal humidity of about 70 to 80% would be quite good for this plant. In terms of pests for this plant, in my research, it seems that the main pests are thrips, mites, and fungus gnats, typical to most ferns, because most ferns enjoy a more moist soil environment. I haven't come across any pests with my rabbit foot fern, which hopefully it's because I've been quite lucky, but I actually think it's more so because this is quite a resilient plant. Again, I keep him outdoors. He can be exposed to the elements, but I actually have not had any trouble with him from a pest perspective. Of course, you want to always check your plants at least once every week, just to make sure you are on top of the pest situation. In terms of getting rid of pests, my go-to solution is mixing some hand wash with water into a soapy spray and spritzing it across your plant. With fungus gnats, a way to get rid of them if you're keeping your plant indoors is place a dish of cider vinegar and water next to your plant. That should attract the fungus gnats out of the moist soil, because that's where fungus gnats like to live. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this video, particularly if you haven't seen a rabbit foot fern before. I really like this plant. I think it's really weird. I really like its rhinestones because I think it's just kind of creepy and cool. I hope you found these tips helpful, guys. As I said at the beginning, if you are getting into ferns or you want to dabble in ferns, I'd recommend getting a rabbit foot fern because it actually is quite easy to take care of. I haven't had much trouble with it. If you have any questions, please let me know either by leaving them in the comments below or just drop me a DM on my Instagram. But otherwise, guys, thank you so much for tuning in to Weird Plant Wednesday, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye!